Hello, welcome to another episode of the Culture of Unrushing podcast, my thinking out loud space to remind us all to pause, exhale, and take a small break from the incessant doing so that we can notice what no longer serves us, break the pattern of operating on autopilot, and from there, create something different and better instead, shifting from the culture of urgency to the culture of unrushing instead. I'm your host and yapper in chief, Agata Sorocka, and let's get started. So, today's topic is very close to my heart. It's one of those things where I really want to grab a megaphone and force people to listen. You're here voluntarily, so that's amazing. Let me first set the scene with a quote from Kay Sargent, who is an interior designer and author focusing on designing neuroinclusive workplaces, who said that when we design for the extreme, we benefit the mean. Mean as in like not mean girls, but like mean in mathematical sense, like in average. And we can create spaces that enable us all to thrive. And so she is speaking of designing the physical space, right? Like as an architect, from the perspective of interior designer, architect who takes into account the varying needs of neurodivergent folks. I think her kids are are neurodivergent. Like better acoustics and like soundproofing, or taking into account like sensoring needs, like gentler lighting or like softer furnishing, like making sure you include like some hideout spots for like more privacy, like clearer wayfinding, and so on, right? And when we take that more acute needs, everyone benefits, right? Even if you're not like so sensitized to that. So like take gentler lighting, for example, right? So even if you are not very sensitive to such stimuli, you will also benefit from like warmer, softer tones rather than this like aggressive, like fluorescent light that like reminds you, at least reminds me of a hospital. And I'm personally more on like the sensitive side, like, and I am often much more aware of what annoys me. And like in terms of like lightning or like sounds and this like sensory needs. And when I speak to my friends or like my family who are not that sensitized, like they often say, "Oh, you know what? Like it's true. Like I was being like annoyed in this room, but like I never really like could pinpoint. I thought I was just like stressed." And like maybe they were, but that got them, like once they thought about it, how the room looked like, they were like, "Oh, you know what? Maybe this was actually like part of why I was more like anxious and alert was how the room was set up, like the lighting." And so maybe it hasn't affected them as much as it would me, but still it was affecting them, right? So that's like an example that, especially with lightning, there's just like so much aggressive lightning everywhere. So that's an example that is very tangible and visceral that most of us can like feel and imagine, right? And that's why I'm starting with it, because I think that this principle of focusing on folks with more acute needs as the blueprint can be used in more contexts. Also, like in virtual spaces, when you design for emotional safety, belonging, introversion, extraversion, connection, and so on and so forth, right? So the question that I want to ask today, and I invite you to think about it as well, is what if we, as event organizers, as online educators, coaches, service providers, used the same principle that many architects and UX designers noticed years ago, which is when you design for the extreme, I don't like this word, but let's keep the quote, for the extreme, so for the folks with more acute needs, folks, maybe let's better use like, I really don't like this word extreme, but like people with more acute needs or like people who need to make extra effort to show up, if we take them as the blueprint from which we start our design process, then everyone benefits. And by doing so, we actually invite more people into our world. And one of the things that I realized recently, because I heard this quote quite recently, but what I realized is that unconsciously, I actually have been operating with that lens in mind, like from my whole life, like throughout both my entire career as a system adoption specialist, as a trainer and educator, and as an annoying citizen who asks too many questions, like why do schools and hospitals, which are like institutions and places that are supposed to support either our learning process or our healing process, look like the like complete antithesis of like the purpose the spaces are supposed to serve, right? Like I had a lot of family members who spent a lot of time in hospitals, and I'm always like why? Why? Like they would heal so much better if like the room, if they could look at trees, if the lighting was better. Like anyway, sadly, probably nobody listening to this podcast has enough power to solve the second point. So maybe we can talk about it at some other point. But today, let's focus instead on the field of our influence and where we, as builders, creators, can create environments that foster more safety and belonging, right? Because I think these are the feelings that, or states that are really worth looking deeper into. So, why not make design decisions from there instead of what everyone else in the industry is doing or what the blueprints in your workplace have been so far? Like, why not introduce something else since we see that often it's just not working as it should? And so my whole approach towards building systems and processes can be described as a human-centered approach. So obviously it's not a term that I coined. It's been there longer than I've been alive, probably. But as with any broad concepts, I think it's worth to take a magnifying glass and look more closely to search for some meaningful details. And I talk a little bit more in the previous episode about like defining ambition. Because it's easy to say like, oh, of course, like I put people in the center of my work, like, right? Like I have clients, I build offers for them, I've written down like their pain points and aspirations, like maybe even I did some structured interviews, right? But what I have seen often happens is that either we focus only on the surface level when we think of like the client or like the user or whoever we put in center, either surface level, assuming that they are like completely rational beings who operate at the same level of capacity every day, even though we know that we contain multitudes, right? Like we're emotional, we're contradictory, we're messy, and that we're not living in the void. Like we're not immune to external circumstances and life simply lifing. Or we focus on a very specific type of person, usually very similar to us, not taking into account that other people have different needs. And in essence, we often have this like simplified avatar in mind and haven't spent enough time getting more curious about other people's varied experiences. And I think that's why I was so drawn to systems like human design, which is a completely different thing than human-centered design, because it shows us like how many different dimensions there are in how people are in the world, right? How they perceive, how they communicate and process information. So, yeah. But today I want to plant a seed and share a bit more about the layers of feelings and emotions that I have been taking into account in my work, which can serve as an inspiration and like a starting point for you. So, when we think of human-centered design of the system, right? Because like I'm a system specialist. The most obvious layer is, how do people actually interact with the system? Why this way? When and why are they looking for a workaround? Do they understand the why? Like, why are we using it in the first place, right? So the focus is on the behavior. But there's also a second layer that is often forgotten about. So the second layer that we often forget about is, how do we ensure that our systems support us when we're not at our best, right? So do we stress test them for such conditions, right? So for example, who's your tester, right? Are you testing with a person who's like in their best form, or maybe when their kid has been sick and they've been sleep deprived for way too long? When you're going through like a breakup or your lease and like you do not operate at the same level of capacity, right? So like your cognitive powers are lower because your capacity is lower, right? So like when we are testing, like who are we testing it for? For like the perfect condition or for the lifing? And you know, like yes, of course, it's like necessary to work on your own nervous system capacity, la 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 la. But what I'm seeing is that we're so used to, as a society, to put all the responsibility on the individual, right? Like just like deal with your shit, you know? Where I think it should be shared and it can be shared, right? So like as designers of anything, as creators, like can we somehow equalize the chances, right? So, and when I say as designers, I don't just mean people whose job title has designer in it, but anyone who designs and create, right? Because it's a very much a verb. So anyone who designs and creates is a designer, right? Like even if your title doesn't say it specifically. And that makes our group a much broader one, right? And a simple real life example, and I talked about it a little bit more in like the free workshop that I recorded recently, which I will link in the show notes, is from the time when I was a teacher, right? So for those of you who don't know, I mean, you probably see me for the first time. So I was teaching Salesforce to a group of unemployed folks who were reskilling, right? And sometimes they would ask the same question like thrice or like 4 times. And like not out of malice or, you know, whatever, but because they're on Zoom all day and they have no daycare for their kids. And, you know, like I don't have kids yet, but I can only imagine and empathize that it must be really hard to be super focused on a new skill that you're learning where, you know, in the background, you're just like trying to navigate your kid being hungry or, you know, needing something. So where I saw my role as a teacher and as a curriculum designer was to be more mindful about that I'm not teaching someone who has full and undivided attention like I can have as like a childless person who has my own space to learn, but be more mindful, for example, about repetition, right? I mean, it's also like one of the elements of effective learning, like repetition, like emotional component, da da da. But being more mindful, like how can I make it easier for them to catch up if they like need to go for a moment, right? Can I like maybe pair them with someone for peer tutoring? Can I remind the same concept more times, or just like have this slide, even if like I don't want them to spend so much time on slides, just so that when they come back, they know where you are. So honestly, it doesn't really matter what you choose, because what I want to pinpoint here is that so many people don't even permit themselves to acknowledge that they need support, to acknowledge like being human, because this is not in line with capitalism values, right? So like grind your teeth, power through, like there's no um excuse, or just there's like no, like, why should you have special treatment? And again, like all responsibility put on the individual, and very little expectations for structure and systems. And actually, people who also, like in online space, like you pay people thousands of euros, like you can expect shit from them. Like not shit from them, you can actually expect them listening to you. And it's very far from being a Karen who wants to talk to manager, right? And it's a spectrum. And I speak from experience here there, because I mentioned it many times in many different places online, but an experience that completely changed my life and like split it into before and after was my mom dying. And I remember being like completely frozen, like zero, zero energy for anything, and still having to show up to my consulting agency work as if nothing happened. Like just take a few days off, come back shining new, just deal with your own shit, ideally outside of the working hours. Like if you must grieve, then grieve on a Saturday, not on Tuesday 2 p.m. That's a bad time to grieve. Like I'm laughing at it now because it's been years, but going through that experience contributed to many things in my life, obviously, that I will keep to myself. I'm not such an exhibitionist, but it truly informed my lens that sometimes shit happens. And when all of like 28 years, I thought that I could power through anything until I couldn't. And that made me realize, and that lack of empathy also made me realize, that since I am also a creator, a designer, and my role allows me to create conditions, spaces for other people, then why not use this empathetic lens? And by the way, like none of my job descriptions ever had a designer in it. Like it's consultant, specialist, da da da. But I've always been creating. I've always been designing, right? Like spaces, experiences, processes for people. So again, coming back to the verb and not to the title. And so I wonder, like, what would happen if more of us who are in the position of designing and creating something that serves other people took this lens, right? So, and I think it's not only an interesting question to ask, but also a very important one to ask. And not everyone has to go for an extremes like me losing my, I mean, everyone will, but it doesn't happen daily. But even like on smaller scales, right? So yeah, moving on. That was more of an overall human-centered lens, right? So that we can go as in like we are humans who don't live in void, life happens, but we can go more granular, like for example focusing on like specific need or emotion that we want to amplify. And let's take the need for connection. Since we have the loneliness epidemic, now a lot of online service providers sell connections and community as part of like their USP, unique selling proposition, in their portfolio, right? In their offer portfolio. However, what often happens is that the connecting like-minded individuals part is left to chance, right? So like they would be selling like a membership and it's like, oh, like, yeah, we are connecting like-minded individuals, right? Like in this membership. And that part of connection is left to chance, assuming that since these people are in the same space, virtual, but also like physical, the connection will just like naturally happen, like back. But this is like, stay with me here. If we follow the same logic to an extreme, right? People who hop on the same bus line every morning can also be, I was so happy when I thought about it, can also be described as like-minded individuals sharing a curated container, moving towards the same goal. And yet, we don't see bus companies using the community element in their marketing, well, because that would be a stretch, right? Just sharing a space is rarely enough for meaningful connection between strangers to happen. Think about it, like in your past experience, like you can take a small pause and just like ponder on your experience. And like nobody is stopping you from striking up a conversation. Like, like when you're in a bus, also nobody is like stopping you. Like you can strike a conversation, ask where they're heading, what their dreams, fears, and aspirations are. But as a frequent public transport user, I have not experienced it many times, and I also probably wouldn't do it. But jokes aside, like, what if when you design your next course, team event, or membership in which you want to amplify the need for connection, especially since you're selling it, like if you like bold it on your page, instead of hoping that folks will find their way to connect since they are in the same space and like boom, done, often because like you are live, maybe, and that I see often in like the online coaching space is that a lot of people are like lives of the party, like like extroverts who like probably never even felt uncomfortable like entering a group of strangers. But when you design it more intentionally, and what I mean by designing intentionally is also like keeping in mind a person who finds it hard to comfortably show up in the group, right? Like, and treat them as like your blueprint. And just asking yourself this question like opens you up to a different point of view and shifts your perspective, right? And from there, you can start getting curious, right? So like you have this person in mind who has it more difficult. And you can start asking yourself, okay, like where have I seen it already? Other people doing it well. Like, am I a part of different communities when I feel like when I see people are people like engage and like make meaningful connections. And I give a good example of how to do it of one of the examples where it was done very well in real life in the Substack that will be linked to this episode. So encourage you to look at it. So that's the first thing. And the second is, who can you actually ask about their experience instead of assuming you know best, so that you don't do what many male directors do when they write a female character. You're just like, oh, do you know even any woman? Like, I don't know any woman who would like act like this, So really get curious about other people. And something I truly recommend to anyone is to dedicate some time to regularly, like as a part of your practice, to just talking to your people. And it's part of like what I do, like part of my like working practice, part of my week, my month routine is to do one-on-one calls for discovery. Usually there's like a one coffee date per week on my calendar. And I know that internet says that, oh, this call could have been an email. And in many cases, yes, but not in this case. Because when you focus on listening to other person, when you come with curiosity, like email could never. And when it comes to those like chats, right? Like how to actually get something meaningful, like have some meaningful feedback out of it. How I structure them is that I usually have like a topic or certain area in mind that I want to know about. But I tend to keep the agenda quite open. And what I focus on is being more present and attuned to what they are saying. And so where do I spot some like emotional charge? Where's like I see like the seed of something important? It's not so easy to articulate, but that's like the skill that I've strengthened over time when I was like reconnecting with my intuition. And actually, that's something that I can record maybe like a separate podcast episode on. So feel free to ask any questions about it. But actually, listen to what's beyond the surface. Like that's my good tip for any like discovery centers. Like, especially when there's shame included. People rarely will say that they're ashamed, but you will see when you look at them, you will see like slight changes in their body, in their voice, where, for example, being shamed comes in line. So anyway, but this is something that I can also talk about for ages. But back to separate times. But back to the example of building for connection, right? Like as a self-identified socially awkward person, I love it when organizers give me options, right? So like oh my God, my hair. Anyway, whatever. You're not here to look at my hair. Where organizers like give me options, right? So like treat the events like a buffet, like having this like alles kann, nichts muss approach, like the German saying goes, that they're like, here are some options. You can dip in, dip out. You can try, you can like engage this way, you can engage that way. So actually not forcing just one single way and just opening yourself as an organizer to giving people options to encourage them to use them, like changes the entire experience. Again, check out my Substack because there was like a really good example of like a connection space that I experience in real life. And therefore, like more people feel seen, more people feel welcome without the need to pretend, like they wouldn't need to pretend that they need to be louder, bolder, different, right? And one last thing is that because I'm wrapping up this entire episode today, because I think it's been a lot, is that you don't need to hold anyone's hand, however that might look online. But a simple acknowledgement that you are open to listening to what format would work for others, rather than just enforcing like one single God-given way is like the gospel, is like a massive improvement that will make more people feel safer and make more people feel like they belong in this group without needing to pretend like they need to be someone else. Usually more extroverted, louder, and just like more pushy. So again, check out the Substack because I think it will really get your imagination wheels spinning of what different options to connect are there. But as I'm wrapping this episode today, kind of like my big wish for you and what you can take away from today, from this like almost half an hour of me speaking, is first, look at what's in your creative control and influence. So where are you creating conditions for other people and like in your role? And how can you start asking yourself these questions? Or how can I acknowledge us, them being human? How can I make it easier for other people? How can I design for the person who has it more difficult in whatever axis or vector that you are focusing on, right? And I'm adding this like axis or vector because it's not about going from 0 to 100, right? Like we can't include everyone everywhere, and that's not even the point. The point is that I believe that the question we ask can open or close our horizons. And when we start to ask different questions, we start building different outcomes. And yes, rolling back to the title of this podcast, different cultures. And like curiosity cannot be rushed. But actually, I am yet to meet a person who ever regretted getting more curious and giving space to people who join their program, their spaces, their workshop. Usually, it always gives them something, a new perspective, new way of life, and better experience for everyone. So, all right, take good care of yourself. That's it for today, and you will hear from me next time. Ciao for now.